I think that a lot of Chelsea fans, a lot of the heat goes on to Todd Boehly for the way that the club is run. But if you actually break down the structure of the way that Chelsea as a business is run, who is the top brass? Who are making these decisions?
Todd Boehly is front of house, but he is not the decision maker. Clearlake owns 60% of Chelsea. Eghbali and Boehly own sort of the rest. And from what I understand, Eghbali is now in charge of the Chelsea business. But he doesn't want the limelight. Todd Boehly is an ebullient character. He's very good for a quote. That those quotes then become legend in their own right, and I think he's there to effectively take the heat, whilst the remainder of the business is run by the nerds and the dweebs, which is the way that private equity works. It's very good at acquiring what it considers to be undervalued assets. It's very good at focusing on bringing in additional money and controlling costs, and that's the nature of private equity, with the aim of making a return ultimately for the people who have invested in Clearlake itself.
Jim, just before we move on to some of the financial breaches that Chelsea may have had under Abramovich, I just want to stick on that point about Todd Boehly being the front of house and the public-facing figure. Do you feel, firstly, that there is enough communication from him to the Chelsea supporters? And also, how important is that for an ownership in the modern era to be more communicative with its fans?
I think it depends, like you said, on who's actually making the decisions, whether it's Todd, whether it isn't. I wouldn't know, to be perfectly honest with you. But clearly they are very, very heavily involved in running the football club. We have an ownership group that's been excellent for Charlton to date. But they effectively employ us as a management group, and we tend to do the majority of the speaking on their behalf, because we're empowered to make decisions within budgets that they set. Clearly, these budgets look like they're being set by Todd Boehly anyway. And if you want to be front of house, you have an obligation to talk to people and tell people what's going on. That's the fact. If you don't want to be front of house, then no problem at all. Empower the chief executive. Some clubs, you don't hear. Well, you do hear from Khaldoon, but you don't hear from Sheikh Mansour at Man City. But you hear from Khaldoon, you hear from Ferran, you hear from these people. Brighton, for example, predominantly it's Paul Barber, but occasionally it's Tony. It just depends how your football club is structured. The most important thing for me is, in terms of communication with the fans, the people that are actually empowered to make decisions, the people that actually know the answers to the things that the supporters want to know about, and they're the people that are communicating. So if you want to be, if it is Todd Boehly that is the top of the Christmas tree at Chelsea, then I think he probably has an obligation to speak to the fans. That said, I think most Chelsea fans would probably say that Roman Abramovich was an excellent owner, and I don't think anybody heard from Roman Abramovich speak ever, and probably didn't hear from Marina much either. And I don't know personally. I've not had enough communication with new Chelsea. I can tell you who ran old Chelsea. I mean, that was as clear as the nose on your face, to be honest with you. Marina was running Chelsea. That is a fact. If you wanted to do a deal with Chelsea, you spoke to Marina. Marina didn't speak to the press particularly often, though she was incredibly capable at her job. So it's about, I guess, the right people, whoever is empowered within that particular organisation, to pass that message on and answer the fans' questions.
So that might maybe surprise some Chelsea fans that in your opinion, this was Marina running the show rather than Abramovich at Chelsea.
Well, I have no doubt at all that if they're going to fire a manager, hire a manager, spend £100 million on a player, whatever that might look like, I have absolutely no doubt that Roman Abramovich was across those types of big decisions. But undoubtedly, Mr. Abramovich clearly empowered Marina to run that football club. I mean, that's what happened. I don't think anybody would dispute that Marina was running that football club, and she was mandated to do so.
Kieran, talking of that Abramovich era and old Chelsea, as Jim put it there, they might learn the fate of a Premier League investigation into some alleged breaches. What kind of breaches are we looking at the moment for Chelsea? Because they're not the only club being investigated.
Well, that's right. In terms of Chelsea, this is the Todd Boehly Clearlake group effectively self-reporting the club with regards to issues which apparently took place or allegedly took place during the Abramovich era. And what these allegations appear to suggest is that there were payments being made either to players or players' representatives, which were not necessarily going through the books of the club itself. They were going through third parties. And if you take a look at the accounts of Chelsea during the Abramovich era, it quite often ended up in the companies controlled in the British Virgin Islands or other offshore places, where the degree of transparency is different to what we're experiencing here in the UK. If that is the case, then I think there are certain parallels with the accusations that have been levelled, or some of the accusations which have been levelled in respect of Manchester City, where once again, people employed by the club were receiving money from third parties. Now, whether that was legitimate or was against the rules is something which we will determine in due course. The Premier League has been silent with regards to any charges against Chelsea to date. So the club is therefore innocent of all these things. But the fact that the story has come out, and presumably it must have been leaked by the hierarchy of Chelsea itself, does suggest that there is an unknown. In addition to that, we have these sales of the real estate assets. Now, have those been at fair value? And then that's the key thing as far as the Premier League is concerned. It did introduce these so-called fair value rules, whereby if you do sell something, then it has to be deemed, anything over £1 million has to be at a market value. Now, a market value for a player, and I'm sure Jim will agree with this, it is quite difficult because players are so unique. I think when it comes to property assets, there tends to be a much bigger market for that. So I think that will be watched with a degree of scrutiny. Having said that, given where Chelsea are located, it is very much prime London estate, and therefore you would think that the club will have done its homework and would have had a report from a surveyor or another professional from the property industry to back up their claims.
And nobody should be under any illusion either. These are serious charges. If Chelsea or Man City, clearly I have no idea whether they did or they didn't, they're all innocent at the moment. If they are found guilty of making these illegal payments, then these are the most serious charges as far as I'm concerned. I think I haven't looked in depth at the 115 Man City charges, but I believe some of the charges are similar, and certainly the charges at Chelsea relate to payments outside of contracts. If they are found guilty of that, the sanctions, this is not slap on the wrist territory. These are some serious sanctions.
Well, how serious could these sanctions be, in your opinion?
I mean, that would be pure speculation. All I do know is that they are serious. This isn't slap on the wrist stuff. This is, footballers have to get paid. Okay, they can have image rights agreements, which have been tied up on now, but they can only be paid by the entity that is the football club, the UK entity that is the football club. They pay all the PAYE at source, and that money has to be paid into a UK bank account. That much is quite clear. Anything that's being diverted from other companies, that is highly irregular in football terms. And if these football clubs are found guilty of these things, I think they are going to have some significant issues. Even though Chelsea self-reported, and I suppose that's a mitigating fact, it's still Chelsea Football Club, regardless of who the ownership is. You buy the football club, warts and all. Whoever, it is still Chelsea Football Club that made those payments, if indeed they were made illegally. So it would still be Chelsea Football Club that copped for it effectively.
Kieran, it's interesting that Jim brings up that Chelsea did self-report themselves. Do you think that they did that because, as Jim says, these are very serious charges? So do you think that they did that in order to potentially get some leniency if it does come to the fact that they are guilty of these charges? Is it a way to potentially make the punishment less?
I think it's the equivalent of handing yourself in at a police station as part of a mitigation. As Jim correctly said, it's Chelsea FC Limited or Chelsea FC Holdings or whatever the iteration of the company is in previous years that has had a potential breach. With regards to a punishment, I think you have to look at it through two issues. First of all, were the monies involved sufficient to have resulted in Chelsea exceeding the PSR limits? If the answer to that is no, because we could be talking, yes, it could be £2 or £3 million, but Chelsea was still within the limits, then you're likely to have some form of financial penalty. But if we take a look at the closer look at the commissions that investigated both Everton and Nottingham Forest, they effectively concluded that anything which results in a club exceeding the PSR limits should be given a points deduction based tariff. So we'd have to go and wait and see. And again, we have to reiterate that Chelsea have done nothing wrong in the sense that they've not been charged with anything to date.